My friend Chip,
Yes,
welcome
Tim.
to the Tim Ferriss Show.
I'm so happy to be here.
So we've known each other a long time.
Yes.
And it's so nice to see you again. And I'm thrilled that we were able to coordinate uniforms.
Yes.
With our respective tailors. We will be busking downtown Austin later today for change, where you are a new citizen.
Yeah.
Or
I
will
love
be
it.
very shortly. Yeah, it's a beautiful town.
Yeah, it really is.
And, I thought we would start, and this may seem somber, but since this is something we were just catching up with maybe an hour ago over lunch, can you talk about your current medical state of affairs, if you wouldn't mind? Because I think it's a wedge that leads us into discussions that can be pretty far-ranging.
Sure.
If you wouldn't mind.
No problem at all. On the second day of a book tour 5 months ago, the day before I was at a TED speakers dinner, so the day before giving a TED talk, I found out I have intermediate stage prostate cancer. And it came as a complete surprise. My urologist had said, after doing a biopsy, probably a 20% chance you've got a problem here. But as it turns out, I had a problem. And so since then, I've had a few different tests. And the good news is I'm right on the cusp of serious versus sort of not serious. Mm-hmm. And so far, we've just looked at the alternative health approach. But I'm all about Western medicine when I need to bring the cavalry across the plantation to sort of say, yes, probably I'm young enough, I'm 58, probably going to live another 30 to 40 years, probably will have my prostate taken out in the next couple of years.
What does that feel like to you to realize or to say? And what is that, for people who may not know, what does that mean? I mean, is prostate like an appendix? You don't really need it?
Well, it does have certain functions, which we can get graphic and get into if you want to. But let me say that, first of all, the big C, the cancer word is like, what? I have cancer. And the good news is prostate cancer, as cancers go, is actually a relatively tame cancer. But that was hard. And then prostate, the prostate, women don't have a prostate, men do. And it's it has a little bit to do with sexual functioning. Actually, it's more to do with the secretion that happens in semen. Mm-hmm. So if you have your prostate taken out, you're no longer going to ejaculate. It does mean you still could potentially have an orgasm, but you just will have a dry orgasm. This is really crazy to be talking about this in the first 5 minutes. I feel like salacious. This is like the Mirror, it's like the front cover, naked nanny or something like that.
We're skipping the foreplay.
This is how we, keep you on the podcast for an hour and a half. So all I can say is cancer can be a teacher.
Yeah.
And for me, it's been a reminder of the vulnerability that we can have, as well as what level of control you do have over your body. And so the fact that I've been sort of focusing on making myself healthier, and so far, until a couple of days ago, the test results had looked really good. Now there's a test result, that's a PSA score that shows that it's spiked a little bit. So we'll have to sort of see with an ultrasound this next week. But I think more than anything, it forces us to ask ourselves, or forces me to ask myself, what am I here on this earth to accomplish and to experience? And it creates a certain level of urgency in life. I had a flatline experience where I went to the other side 10 and a half years ago, and that did the same thing for me. So
that was in St. Louis.
That was in St. Louis. Thank you for the memory on that one. Yes, it was in St. Louis, and I had been going through a difficult time, and I had a broken ankle from a bachelor party with Gavin Newsom, and I had a cut on my leg, which had a bacterial infection in it because Gavin had his bachelor party at 18D Ballpark, where the San Francisco Giants play. And I hit a triple out to the outfield and slid into third base and broke my ankle, but got fertilizer in my leg on the cut. I didn't know. And so I've had a couple experiences of just being a wake-up call, which is an interesting term for a hotelier, to have a wake-up call and sort of say, you know what? You are still alive, but are you living your life the way you want to live your life?
And the reason I thought this could be as good a place as any to start is that in all my interaction with you from the very beginning, which goes back at least 10 years, probably more, I've been struck by how aware you strive to be of your thinking and how many times you have changed chapters very deliberately And so I thought this could be a segue into conversations about some of those chapter changes and how you thought through them, and also just impactful periods in your life.
Yeah.
And I thought maybe if you're willing to, I think it was a quote, I could be getting this wrong, so feel free to fact check, but the Shakespeare quote, was it? That you shared when we were having lunch, which I think
it's beautiful.
It's appropriate
The
here.
meaning of life is to find your gift, and the purpose of life is to give it away. Now, it's been actually sometimes been called Shakespeare, sometimes called Picasso. Picasso has a great quote, too, that relates to modern elder, which is, computers are useless, they only give you answers. We'll come back to that one.
Yeah.
But yeah, the idea of finding your gift, the meaning of life is to find your gift, the purpose of life is to give it away. And that, I think that's been very much embedded in my heart and my soul and my mind over my 35, 37 years of being in the business world.
And for people who aren't familiar with Chip, what is the introduction, the context you'd like to give, or if it's easier, how would someone introduce you at a speaking engagement?
Well, the way they introduce me at the speaking engagements often is, this is the guy who's disrupted his favorite industry twice. And that industry happens to be hospitality. I was one of the first boutique hoteliers, along with Ian Schrager and Bill Kimpton. I started a company called Joie de Vivre. Joie de Vivre was based in San Francisco, created 52 boutique hotels, second largest boutique hotelier in the U.S. And then after 24 years of running that, soon after I had my flatline experience, which was a wake-up call to say I didn't want to be running that company anymore, I was asked 6 years ago by the three young founders of Airbnb to come join them and take their little tech startup and turn it into a global hospitality brand. So I have been a disruptor twice. And so I've also written 5 books, and I most recently have created the world's first midlife wisdom school called the Modern Elder Academy.
And we're going to talk about all of this.
Yeah.
So many places to go. I thought we would start with one of your more glamorous periods. Could you tell us how you got into commercial real estate?
You know, I grew up in California. So everybody in California has sort of like the real estate bug. And I went to work for my uncle the summer, and then almost most of my junior year at Stanford. He was a commercial real estate developer in Silicon Valley. This was 1980. It was full of orange groves. Silicon Valley was nothing like it is today. And I just saw everybody making money and sort of having a good time in commercial real estate. What I was fascinated by was the creative side of it. How do you design environments? And ultimately, I went to Stanford Business School straight out of undergrad and focused on real estate there. And then went to work for a real estate developer in San Francisco for a couple of years. And
that was after Stanford.
That was after Stanford Business School. And then that's when I said, you know what? The part of real estate that's really interesting is hotels.
What did you think you were going to do as an undergrad? Did you know real estate was the answer? Let's say freshman, sophomore year. What did you envision adult Chip doing in the world?
I thought I was going to be a philosopher. You and I could have hung out together.
Well, yeah, you are kind of...
Do a little Seneca, Marcus Aurelius debate.
Before it was cool.
Yeah, exactly. No, I took a class called God, Self, and the Body or something like that in freshman year, and I just loved it. So I thought, but everybody said, like, what are you going to do with a philosophy major? So I thought I might go into politics, like helping in a governmental role. And I did a summer in DC as an intern and didn't love it. And so business became sort of the next thing. Mm-hmm. And I guess I have been sort of a philosopher in business. That's part of the reason I like writing books about it. But I had no idea I was going to get into commercial real estate. And then at on my 26th birthday, I finished a business plan to create this boutique hotel company called Joie de Vivre, which is a really impractical name for a company, especially in the U.S., because it's hard to pronounce, hard to spell. Most people don't know what it means. It means joy of life. But very few companies in the world have a mission statement that's also the name of the company. And that's what really resonated with me. And bought a broken down motel, pay-by-the-hour motel in the Tenderloin, called it the Phoenix, and it became a rock and roll hotel and a big sensation, and that's how I got started.
So if we back up a little bit and revisit Stanford Business School, in the course of preparing for this, read about brainstorming sessions that you did. I think they were a few hours in length.
Yeah.
I hesitate to say 4 hours because, of course, I'm the 4 hour guy. But I think that in the article it was 4 hours.
Yes.
And there were some other characters involved.
You've done your research.
Whose names may be recognizable. I think Seth Godin was also.
Seth and I we both wrote our first books together back when we were in our second year of business school. Yeah, this group, it was 5 guys. We were the 5 youngest guys in the class. 2 of us went straight into business school. The other 3 had 1 year off. And we were sort of not well liked generally within the business school class because we were just the innocent, naive, dumb
fresh
shits.
off the boat.
Yeah, so we sort of created our own little club and we were brainstorming business ideas. And
was there a format to it? Did you guys meet on a regular basis?
We met on a regular basis, and it was really the best way to describe it. It was each one of us would bring an idea to the table, and then we'd critique it. And Seth is a good critic.
Yeah, he's a very good critic.
And so that was partly how I got to know Seth, and ultimately Seth and I didn't love business school, and so our second year of business school, we said, why don't we write a book, get credits for writing the book, use that experience to go out and interview a bunch of famous people who will talk to us because we're business school students, but once we graduate, they won't talk to us because they'll think we're looking for a job.
Use that Stanford while you can.
And we did, and we created a book called Business Rules of Thumb, and it came out long time ago. And Seth at that point had caught the bug. He knew he was going to write books. I hadn't caught the bug. I wasn't until about 16, 18 years later that I wrote what I consider my first book. I don't actually count that book as one of my 5 books, unfortunately. I don't think Seth counts it as well.
It's so if people are listening and they like the idea of forming a group like this.
Yes.
Because I think that, at least in the piece that I'd taken a look at, the consensus of some of the people in the group was that you learned more through those sessions than you did through the coursework.
Yeah.
So if people out there listening and they think they want to create their own group, whether they call it a mastermind or a brainstorming group or whatever it might be, where they have the opportunity to put people, say, in the hot seat and to have their ideas critiqued and to offer the same. Do you have any guidelines or recommendations on how to do that well, or what the necessary ingredients are? Well,
I think the most important thing is to have clarity about what the purpose is. That's sort of true in life and true with any business, but it's actually true with a group. And so the fact that we knew this was a brainstorm around business ideas, mostly entrepreneurial ideas, was absolutely clear. If you don't have that clear, then people are using it for different purposes. And it's fine to have different purposes as long as people sort of know each other's agenda. So I think that's key. I think another thing that's key is while it can be like intellectual jousting, and so it can be hardcore, there has to be at least an underlying respect. If the purpose of it is to just, skewer each other, people start to shut down or stop showing up.
Yeah. And
so that's critical. And at the end of the time, we also had a good time. I think that was a big piece of it as well.
How long did they last?
They could, we did it for the 2 years.
And
that
what
we were
was
in
the purpose?
School.
What was
the big purpose really was, I think all 5 of us wanted to graduate and become entrepreneurs straight out of business school. I don't think any of the 5 of us did that. Some of us went to work for very entrepreneurial ventures. But I think what we really wanted to do was incubate some interesting ideas such that in that second year of business school, we might determine if we were going to actually create a business plan. I think probably it did incubate an idea. I had an idea in one of those sessions where I talked about creating sort of an urban retreat resort where people would go and go to workshops and classes, and it would be a place where you could sort of get away from the city, but in the city. Mm-hmm. There's a place called the Esalen Institute in Big Sur, and I've been on the board for basically a decade, and I've been teaching there for a long time. It was sort of like that place.
The bookstore is dedicated to you.
The bookstore is dedicated to me. Thank you. It is because I gave some money. It's the only reason, not because I'm a great author or anything like that. But so the bottom line is I said, why isn't there an Esalen in the city? And that was an idea that percolated. Ultimately, it led me to buying a no-tell motel in the Tenderloin of San Francisco, which is not exactly that idea. But I think it was...
What year was this roughly?
So 84 was when we graduated, so when I think probably came up with that idea. And it was 86 that I came up with the idea of Joie de Vivre and buying this motel in the Tenderloin. So sometimes you're planting a seed.
Yeah.
I mean, what's great about life is, your brain, your soul, your spirit, your ability to channel something deeper than you from far off in the cosmos. These are things that actually sometimes take time.
Yeah.
And so planting seeds early is wise.
Well, this is part of the reason I wanted to ask you what you thought you might be or what grabbed you as an undergrad, because maybe I'm forcing a narrative, but I don't think so, because I've seen this before in that you have philosophy, it grabs you, it has great appeal, but you don't know what to do with it at the time, so you bookmark it.
Right.
Don't expect to ever come back to it.
Yeah.
And then you plan on X, but you can't do it right away. And it seems to me, at least for myself, I try to do this. If something really excites me, I assume that there's probably a place for it or a role for it. It just might have to incubate for a while.
Exactly. The question is timing.
Yeah.
And what form it'll take. So, yeah, I think for me, the thing that was really interesting is that writing that book with Seth, the second year, incubated 16 or 18 years later in my first official book, which was called The Rebel Rules, Daring to Be Yourself in Business. And Richard Branson wrote the foreword. And I think that for me, the thing that became clear to me was, and has been a practice my whole business career, is making a weekly inventory of what I learned that week has been essential. And I think that every Friday afternoon, I started doing it when I was in my mid-20s. And I would almost do a half hour to an hour, usually on Friday afternoon, sometimes over the weekend, and said, here are some of my key lessons of the week. And I created a wisdom book, and it was called The Wisdom Book. And that wisdom book was the collection of lessons that I was learning along the way. And it wasn't like I went to the wisdom book all that often to look at it. I did do it. In dark times, I would go there. But generally, it was just the act of putting it down that was planting a seed in my consciousness to take notice.
When did you stop doing that? Or did you stop doing it?
I still do it.
You still do it?
I still do it.
So if I may.
Yeah. And today's Saturday.
Today's Saturday.
So Friday on the flight to Austin, which I missed the flight. I had to fly to Houston and then take a lift from Houston here. I did my list. And this list was a really interesting list because this was a weird week. Now, obviously, this is going to be out in the public in a few weeks. But this week was the week that a New York Times article came out about our new Modern Elder Academy. And as people say, it's a great article, but it's not really very accurate. And to my mind, a great article is very accurate. So I don't love this article. And it's forced me to reacquaint myself with one of Viktor Frankl's famous three lines from Man's Search for Meaning. And so that went into my lessons this week, which was between stimulus and response, there is a space. In that space is your power to choose your response. And in your response lies your growth and your freedom. And I had to really watch that. I had to look at those three sentences over and over because I was just getting more and more indignant and almost feeling betrayed by the journalist because, she didn't give a factual story. So long story short is this week, my list of lessons were very much about emotional regulation, and which is really something that we learn as we get older.
Yeah.
There's a lot of things that as we get older, we are very aware of the things that actually get worse with time, but we're actually not as aware of the things that get better with time.
How long is, say, the total set of bullets for this week? Is it a page? Is it 2 pages?
It depends on the week. The bloodier the week, the more the more bullet points there are. The average week is about 5.
Five bullets.
5 bullets of,
Oh, look at that.
On Fridays.
Five bullet Fridays.
That's interesting. Well, your bullets and my bullets are different. My bullets are really actually lessons. Yours are.
You're not like here's my favorite spatula I found this week, and your lessons learned. No,
nothing like that. No, they're actually they're deep and sometimes painful. This week there were probably 12 bullets, and some of them are like tactical.
Yeah. Are you willing to share any of them?
Yeah. Like one of them was, I said to my PR person, I got this article on my own. I know the author, the journalist. And I wouldn't say we're friends, but we know each other moderately well. And I think she'd probably prefer just the one-on-one. And she did. but I didn't necessarily have someone there to sort of say, hey, yeah, Chip said these things, and why are those not in the article? And you put something else in there that he didn't say. And so I think part of it for me was, okay, yes, it's normal to have someone there as a PR specialist, especially for an article as important as, say, the New York Times would be. That's another example. I gave the Frankel example. Another one is when things are troubled, it's the most important time for the higher you are in an organization to be calm, because our mirror neurons mean that our emotions are contagious. And everybody tends to look at the most senior person to see how they're reacting to something. And so when something goes askew, people look to the leadership to see, are they sweating?
Yeah.
And I'm not saying that we shouldn't be authentic and transparent, but you can be both vulnerable and a visionary at the same time.
You can also be very serious and calm at the same time.
Yeah, for sure.
If need be. Yeah.
So I think that I've tried to be that way and not, get like so wrapped up in a reaction. Frankel's quote is really about reaction.
Yeah.
Response versus react. And the longer we're on this earth, often the better we get at being responsive as opposed to reactive.
What other practices or books or resources, anything at all, has helped you in developing your, what was the phrase you used? Not emotional resilience, regulation.
Yeah, I think I've been lucky enough. I'm like awful at yoga. People say, "Oh, you got the yoga body. You sort of seem like you're like a yoga guy." And I was like, I'm really tight. I have a hard time with that. But I'm really good at meditation. And I took to it 35 years ago, and I've integrated it into my life ever since then. And I would say a morning practice of just meditating, as well as sometimes an afternoon practice or a practice when I'm most stirred up, is to just close my eyes, give myself 10 minutes to just absolutely get into a mantra of just breathing. And, that actually is a way of, regulating myself. Clearly exercise, and just getting it out of your system and getting out of your brain. I mean, so much of emotional regulation is learning to get out of your brain. And so I've done that too. But I will say, back to the yoga for a second, I think there's two ways that I look at life, and that's to be in an attainment mode, trying to attain something, and in an attunement mode. And what I've found is that my natural tendency is very attain oriented.
Yeah.
And when I'm in the attain mode, I often have to atone afterwards because I have sharp elbows and I'm just going for what I want.
Attain and when attune or atone.
Well, it's attain, leads to atonement. Attune leads to at one. So for me, that's been something for about a year now. I've been able to sort of see myself and so ask myself, am I stirred up because I'm in the attain mode? Attain is perfectly fine, yet yoga is not an attained sport. Surfing, which I, at age 57, 56, 57, I'm 58 now, I started learning to surf. This is not an attained sport.
Yeah.
The key is to attune yourself to the wave.
Yeah.
And so recognizing when you're supposed to be in the attain mode and when you're supposed to be in the attune mode is something that I think I've learned over time.
And is your meditation practice mostly focusing on the breath and letting arise whatever arises without trying to modify it, or what is your internal practice look like when you sit for those 10 minutes?
I have a lot. So I've done TM, and that's a 20-minute practice, and that's sort of my core go-to that I do. Yeah, but mantra based. Try to do it morning and afternoon. At minimum, I do it the morning. I do a lot of other ones as well. There's a loving kindness meditation that I, sometimes will do, which sort of when I'm most stirred up about someone in particular, I could sort of go that direction. I love Vipassana, but that's more of an extended silent meditation practice. And I like right now, 2 years ago, I was in Loreto Bay in Baja, kayaking with a guy named Mark Coleman, who wrote a book called Awake in the Wild, beautiful book. Kayaking with him and 12 of us from island to island amongst whales with a silent kayaking meditation retreat for a week. Didn't talk for a week. That was beautiful. So I think, but the simplest thing to do, I think of two things. It's breathing, learning how to breathe. The thing that I do, that's the Chip Conley little trademark, is I think of louvered windows in my forehead.
Hold on a sec. What windows?
Louvered, like, like sort of glass louvered windows. So you sort of open them and they just sort of like, they turn. And so actually the reason I like them is we have them at the Phoenix Hotel.
I was going to say they're sort of like they make me think of really old Volkswagen camper buses that have that type of rotational window.
Exactly. So you have a rotational
it's like the
window.
vents in an air conditioning duct in a car.
Exactly. Imagine that on your forehead.
Okay.
And so what I do is I breathe through my forehead and then I breathe out my forehead. And this is how I turn down the heat on my brain. I mean, truly, this is like the Chip Conley approach.
Yeah, whatever works.
Yeah. So that's, but the core thing I tend to do is the TM.
And for people who are interested in the second you mentioned, which is loving kindness meditation, also known or called Metta. METTA, there are some fantastic guided meditations that you can listen to out there. Like Jack Kornfield has some fantastic versions of that. There's also a really fascinating guy named Chade Meng Tan who wrote a book called Joy on Demand that gets into this.
And Search Inside Yourself too.
And Search Inside Yourself, which became the most popular employee class at Google at one point. I remember they had a waiting list of like 6 to 12 months or something like that. So let's go back to something you mentioned. Your first book, the first book you count. How old were you when you wrote that, roughly?
I was 38 when I wrote it, and I'd been running my company for a dozen years, Joie de Vivre, and
how did you get Richard Branson to write the foreword?
Great question. Gavin Newsom, at that point, he was the mayor of San Francisco, and he was my first mentee. I mentored him at Mentee. So we went together to see him and give a talk at the Virgin record store in San Francisco.
I remember that.
Used to exist.
I remember
so it was
that.
actually around the launch of that record store. It's hard to imagine.
Right on Market Street.
Yeah,
right?
I remember like a record store, really. Wasn't that long ago, though. But so we went there, and we were there with like the head of protocol for the city. And actually, this was before Gavin was mayor. He was just on the board of supervisors in San Francisco. And I don't know, he just took a liking to both of us. And so he said, can we hang out? And
how did you meet him in person?
We were literally in line to actually have him sign our book. And it was me and Gavin. And so when we came up, he just ended up spending a bunch of time with us. And we waited a little bit later, and he talked with us, just the two of us. And we went out and had a meal.
I'm going to keep chipping away at this, no pun intended. So you walk up. You're good with words. Gavin's also good with words. So you guys walk up. There's a long line of people. What do you say or ask that gets the attention of someone, or what is the presence that you put forth that gets the attention of someone like Richard Branson, who in that environment he's the king?
I can't remember the names right now, but I learned his parents' names, his mother and his father. And so I went in the front
I knew
line.
there was something.
I went in the front of the line and I said, so what influence did so-and-so and so-and-so have on who you are today? And he looked at me like, how do you know them? So that led to the conversation.
Amazing.
That led to a longer conversation.
Amazing. Now, did you propose hanging out after the signing, or did he? Did Gavin?
Well, it was the next day. And we just had lunch the next day. And the truth is that his company, Virgin, it was just in the early stages, I think, of thinking about doing Virgin America, the airline. And I was, at that point, the largest hotelier in San Francisco in terms of the number of hotels we had. So there was some benefit to him as well.
How did you make the jump from him being impressed that you knew his parents' names to meeting the next day?
Actually, he had an assistant there, and his assistant actually did know me and knew Gavin. So she was like wise enough to know these are two. And she said, so he said, can you go talk to April over there? And so we went over and talked to April, and April said, you know what, he's got some time to schedule tomorrow. And so
amazing,
yeah.
And then flash forward, and you have a forward from Richard Branson.
So yeah, ultimately he said, I'll write it, but you're going to write the first draft, and and then he edited it, and it went in it.
All right, so we're gonna continue this forward and backwards chronology, if I can even call it such. who's Brenda Lee? And this may go somewhere, it may not go anywhere. But
Brenda Lee is this 4'10", although she's 5'6" with her beehive hairstyle, Nashville gal, famous country western singer. And out of the blue, her pink bus, was driving through the Tenderloin in San Francisco looking for a place to stay. And this was about a month after we opened my first hotel, the Phoenix.
Paint a picture of the Tenderloin at this point.
Well, it's the same as it is now.
It hasn't changed that much.
Yeah, there's a lot of drugs on the street, and it's a relatively poor neighborhood, pretty desolate, but it's right in the middle of the city. It's right near Union Square in the hotel district. So we were the gateway to the Tenderloin, but we were on the opposite side of the Tenderloin from where the nicer part of the Tenderloin and Union Square was. So she's driving through there, and they're looking for a place to stay, and she wanted a motel, and we were a motel. She comes in. She had no idea that our aspiration was to be a rock and roll hotel. And so she comes in, and we had, weirdly enough, a guy named Arlo Guthrie staying at the hotel at the same time.
Listened to Arlo Guthrie when I grew up.
Oh my God!
So I know Arlo Guthrie
this land
very
is your
well.
land. That's
amazing! Yeah.
So Arlo Guthrie's in the hotel because the Great American Music Hall is 2 blocks away. Brenda Lee comes in with her bus, and we have bus parking. So one of the beautiful things about the Phoenix is it had free bus parking, which a band's going to appreciate. And she checks in, and all of a sudden, we'd become a rock and roll hotel. We had Arlo Guthrie and Brenda Lee, and that led to, Nirvana, Pearl Jam, David Bowie, Red Hot Chili Peppers,
Okay.
everybody you can imagine staying there over the years.
So the way you tell the story, it's like they show up, and then all of a sudden we're a rock and roll hotel. I know there's more to the story.
No, there's more to the story.
No. So you have manifested or chanced upon this luck of having these 2 guests at the same time.
Yeah.
How does that then get converted into a reputation? Do they just recommend to other people? Do you seize upon that? Hey, can we take some photos? How does it?
So there was some logic. So my business school brain was saying, okay, well, who's the person who books all of the hotel rooms for bands coming through town? And I'd gotten to know Bill Graham, who's a music impresario, a concert promoter, and he had said, well, it's usually the concert, whoever's booking the concert, they're doing it. So we tried to market to them. Then we tried to market to the venues like Slim's or the Great American Music Hall or the Fillmore. That made sense. And then we found out, there's these travel agents who specialize in entertainment travel. So let's go to market to them. To be honest with you, none of those worked all that well. They worked okay. The number one thing that worked, this is so funny, was the person who typically made the decision of where the band was going to stay was the tour manager. So the tour manager was usually a guy, almost always a guy, about 3 to 5 years older than the band. His job was to make sure there was no overdoses and no groupies. And because a groupie might mean the guy doesn't show up at the show. And of course an overdose could do that as well. And by the time he got to San Francisco, he was so stressed out because usually the tour started on the East Coast. And by the time he got to San Francisco, so here's what we did. We had one room of our 44 rooms that was a massage treatment room. Now, back in the old days when it was a pay-by-the-hour place, you can imagine what happened in there. But we cleaned it up and we made it into a legitimate massage studio. And so we offered to tour managers, when you bring your band here, if you give us 10 room nights, 5 rooms times 2 nights, you get a free massage for yourself. And so back in the day when we started doing that, now remember, this is pre-cell phones, pre-internet, frankly, laptop computers. People had satellite phones, but mainly what they were doing was going on the house phone and the tour manager's calling his friends and then sometimes writing a letter and sending it out to them in old school US mail and saying, there's this place in San Francisco that actually gives you a free massage. And that's when I realized that really great entrepreneurs don't deliver on your expectations. Well, they hopefully do. They deliver on your expectations. They deliver on your desires. But the thing they get right is this thing at the peak of the pyramid. I wrote a book called Peak, How Great Companies Get Their Mojo from Maslow. It's meeting the unrecognized needs of whomever your customer is. And in my case, figuring out that the customer was not all those other people. It's actually the tour manager. And what's his unrecognized need? It's basically to chill and to relax and then get a free massage.
That's incredible. And because it also acts as a contrast in my mind to a maxim that is often used, but I think often inaccurate, which is granted you had this motel/hotel, but you need money to make money.
Yeah.
But if you look at what you did in that particular case, I mean, you identified who your actual customer was. It was like the unspoken customer.
Yeah.
Right. And then,
no one told me. No one ever said that it was the tour manager.
Yeah. And then the unspoken need, and the cost to offer that service is just a rounding error. It's a great entrepreneurial story to sort of suggest that sometimes it's not the thing that's most obvious, and it's not the thing that's the most expensive. Yeah.
But this idea of the unrecognized need, how do you mind read your customer well enough to know what it is that they would love? We have a hotel later that we created, which you and I have been to, the Hotel Vitale, which is on the waterfront in San Francisco.
I wrote a bunch of 2 of my books there.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah.
Well, so long story short, the Hotel Vitale, like the Phoenix is in like the worst neighborhood in San Francisco, and the Vitale is sort of like the best neighborhood. It's right on the bay, on the Embarcadero, right across from the ferry building and the farmers market. So the unrecognized need for the customer we wanted there. So the Vitale means vitality in Latin or in Italian. And we wanted to create a hotel that was sort of what we called for the person who was post W and pre Four Seasons. David Brooks would call him the bourgeois bohemian, so the Bobo.
The hospitality tweeners.
Yes, the hospitality tweener who sort of was looking for that. And so our point of view was, we said this is a person who reads real simple and dwell. So it's actually probably more female oriented, and it's a female business traveler. And if there are 5 adjectives to define those 2 magazines, modern, urbane, fresh, natural, and nurturing, that describes this person. And so we ended up creating on the top floor of the Hotel Vitale when we launched 15 years ago, a yoga studio on the penthouse level that had free yoga classes every morning. Now my investors looked at me like, and they're all guys, looked at me like, what are you doing? Now, today, this might make sense. 20 years ago, when we were concepting this, they're saying like, there is no financial district hotel in the world that has a yoga studio on the penthouse level. Like, why would we ever do that? And I said, well, because we're going to be the first ones doing it. And so then they said, well, look at all of the customer satisfaction forms you've gotten from people in financial district hotels. And have they asked for a yoga studio? And the answer was no, 10,000 of them. We looked at 10,000. Not one person ever said, why don't you have a yoga studio in your hotel?
Yeah.
But if you're good, and if you really understand your customer, it goes beyond the expectations, beyond the desires, beyond focus groups. It's the thing you know that they want next that they don't even know they don't want.
Right?
They don't even know they want. So long story short is the yoga studio had a line out the door, and within a month, we were in New York Times, LA Times, Wall Street Journal had stories about this new sort of hotel that's oriented toward business travelers who want to stay healthy. And the Hotel Vitale ended up becoming the most successful upscale hotel in San Francisco.
It's reminiscent to me of, and this could be apocryphal. I don't know if this is a real anecdote. It's kind of like every quote is attributed to Abraham Lincoln or Oscar Wilde on the internet. But
did you know they had a thing, the two of them? I'm kidding.
No. A quote off. Henry Ford, I think, if I had asked people what they wanted, they would have said a faster horse.
That's Henry Ford.
Yeah.
At least attributed to.
Yeah.
We can't ask him at this point.
And to look under the hood on that decision a little bit. So the first is, and this is something that I'm constantly, maybe constantly is too strong a word, but I always consider when I'm looking at launches or books or television shows or documentaries, whatever it is being first. I think the doing something the first time can be really undervalued. Like the being second, different story, right? Being first can be very, very newsworthy in and of itself. Also, what would you have done if it hadn't worked? Like
we would have turned it into a suite,
right?
I mean, so the key there, and it's that you just said it exactly right, which is my point to my investors was, give me 6 months. Let me try this. We can ratchet and make it into a suite. And in fact, after we sold the hotel a bunch of years later, that's what they did. But I said, give me that time, because this was not going to be insurmountable if it didn't work out. But it turned to package and position the brand of the hotel really well and be something that people valued. But I think the point on that is to sort of say, okay, so how do you try things and do something small enough, but that could have a big impact that is easily solvable if it doesn't work?
Right. Which is also, something that could be tied into Richard Branson, right? Because people think of Richard Branson as this throw caution to the wind maverick who risks it all despite the odds. And he's been on the podcast, but you've spent time with him. And if you look at, I believe it was Virgin Atlantic, where he took so many in-between steps to cap the downside on something that could be unmitigated, a complete disaster, right? Airlines. It's like magazines, restaurants, like you can really lose your shirt. Yeah. And among other things, tested with, I want to say like a poster board in an airport when a flight was canceled, something like Virgin Airlines, and it was a chartered flight that he was going to book if he got enough people to sign up for, the 8 or 10 seats that it would take, did that successfully, and then negotiated with, I want to say it was Boeing at the time, in order to be able to give them back the plane if it didn't work. Yeah. Right. So behind the scenes, he's actually making very, very calculated bets.
He's a shrewd guy.
Super shrewd.
Yeah. And I think, one of the things I learned from my dad a long time ago is build the business plan as if it's not going to succeed. I mean, imagine it succeeding and you're going to attract people for that, for investors, employees, but what's plan B, and how do you have a solution for plan B? And so that's why I don't build bowling alleys. Bowling alleys sort of like in terms of the shape of them is, you could set in the past churches, but churches have become sort of popular for all kinds of uses post-church era. But yeah, I think it's really critical to sort of understand what is plan B, C, and D.
So let's talk about another chapter shift. And I'm going to take this opportunity to pull up a screenshot of a text exchange that I had with a mutual friend of ours, with Liz Lambert.
Oh, yes.
So could you explain for people who don't know who Liz is, just for a second?
So Liz Lambert hates me because she even said on your podcast she hates me because I did for her what now I hope and expect she does for other people, which is she reached out to me almost 20 years ago. I had become a successful entrepreneur hotelier, a boutique hotelier, and she was creating this funky little motel here in Austin called the Hotel San Jose, and similar to my Phoenix. And she liked what we did with the Phoenix, although she was going to do something that was a little more upscale. And she wanted my help. And so I came here and gave her some suggestions. And then I actually sent my general manager from the Phoenix, Monica Bernstein, down here to Austin, basically to help her get launched.
Why did you do that?
She wasn't here for that long, but she was here for, I can't remember, but like weeks at a time. I did it partly because I loved Liz. I love, she's an attorney who should never have been an attorney, who's completely amazing as a designer. So she's one of those hoteliers who designs her own hotels, which I love. That's sort of like, like a restaurateur where the chef is the restaurateur. So I think that's really beautiful. And so I just loved her passion and her sense of her joie de vivre, frankly. She took such a joy in what she was doing. And I wanted her to succeed. And so, I'm a big believer in karmic capitalism, which means sort of what goes around comes around. And so me giving to Liz was going to pay back to me in some way over time. And frankly, it's been me doing that with a lot of different people and then having it come back reputationally. Your reputation is one of the few things in your life that's portable. And frankly, it arrives FedEx before you arrive somewhere because that's what happens with a reputation. People know you before you arrive. And I think that whether it's Liz or a variety of other people who I have tried to help in business, it's just helped my reputation in terms of how people see me. And instead of people standing on the sidelines sort of like jeering, they're cheering. They want, when the New York Times article came out this week and I didn't love it, I had such a support network of people who just said, you know what, we're going to write letters to the editor because it's not a bad article, Chip, but you know what, it's not accurate. And they wanted to help. And I think, I once had a restaurant tour, co-founded a restaurant with someone, and no one really liked her. She was actually very shrewd, really tough negotiator. But when she launched a restaurant, if she got a bad review, people were sort of silently happy. And I'm not that way. And I'm not saying that to say I'm the most likable person in the world, but I will absolutely say that I do a lot of things to make that karmic capitalism work for me in the world. And as such, Liz was just an example of that. And the reason she hates me is because now she feels the obligation to pass it on, pay it forward to someone else, because she gets hit up all the time because she's just an amazing hotelier.
She's really incredible, and she's
company's called Bunkhouse,
and she has a number of just incredible, not just incredible properties, but incredibly different properties.
Yeah, they're soulful.
Yeah.
At the end of one of her pools, the St. Cecilia pool here in Austin, it just has, neon soul. And there's something soulful to her places. And so I want to bet on people like that.
Yeah. There are a lot of parallels that I can see looking at the two of you side by side in some ways. And it just struck me that I did a number of staycations at Hotel Vitale to work on books, because I think I had read that Maya Angelou had done that, and I thought that's a great idea, because at home I have all the usual distractions and ways to procrastinate. Let me treat this.
Moby would do that Moby would do that. He'd go to a hotel room and just shut himself off for a week and to actually figure out music.
No kidding.
Yeah.
So I have friends here. I won't mention their names, but they're well-known filmmakers, because they told me this just in a private conversation, who use Hotel St. Cecilia for their sort of staycation creative work as well. So I'm going to jump to this text from Liz. She had a number of questions. I asked her, are there any particular questions or topics that you think could be interesting or fun to explore? So one of them, she gave me quite a few, but one of them was, he, meaning you, Chip, began building Joie de Vivre as a young man. It was the work of the first half of his life, a big sprawling family. What made him decide to sell it when he did?
So, great question. The one thing, to you aspiring entrepreneurs and people who are younger than me, just know that one of the natural tendencies is we hook our sense of self-esteem and self-worth to our businesses. I remember in the early days of the Phoenix, I had one hotel before I had 52. And that one hotel, when people come up to me and say, "How are you doing, Chip?" I said, "Well, the Phoenix is doing fine." And finally somebody called me on it. It's like, I didn't say how I'm doing. So my sense of worth and esteem had a lot to do with basically the roller coaster of my business. Well, fortunately, over time, I realized that didn't have to be the case. And it was that flatline experience I had 22 years into running my company that helped me to see that, is this what I want to do the rest of my life? Actually, it's not. And I thought it was going to be, but it wasn't. And more than anything, I just realized that I started the company for creativity and freedom. Those are the things I said to myself on one Friday afternoon when I said, what did I learn this week about why I'm starting this business? And 22 years later, I said, do I have any creativity and freedom in this business anymore? No, I'm like running a company with 3,500 people. So that's what led me to, it was hard though. It was very hard to sell a business that ultimately when I sold it was 24 years, that has been your identity for most of your adult life. But it was actually harder for other people than for me. And that's a fascinating piece of it, is I realized my identity had moved on. I was ready for what's next, which was to become the world's leading expert on festivals. And I didn't really want to be doing it anymore. But I had to deal with other people's challenge in me changing my identity. And there's lots of ways people change their identity. You can get divorced. You can, change your career completely. You can literally change your gender. But in my case, it was just changing the actual fact that I was the founder and CEO of what was the largest boutique hotel company, second largest in the U.S., but the largest hotel company, frankly, in the San Francisco Bay Area. And for some people who liked having their friend have that role and got a lot of free hotel rooms out of it from me, or restaurant reservations or massages in my spas, they didn't like it. But at the end of the day, it was the right decision.
So that, as you just said, it sounds like a difficult decision, or a maybe emotionally intense decision to work through. And I mean, I remember when this was kind of happening, and you mentioned just in passing here, I decided what I wanted to do next, which is become the worldwide expert on festivals. Did you need to find that before you were comfortable on some level with making the decision to move on? Or did you make the decision to move on, pull the trigger, and then find that next thing?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. I made the decision this was going to kill me if I kept doing it. And so I knew I needed to move on. I didn't know what, and frankly, then you get into the freaky, it was in the Great Recession, the freaky thought of like, how am I going to sell this company in the bottom of the recession? So I hadn't yet found the new thing I was moving toward. I knew what I was moving away from, but moving towards something is really important, because otherwise, when you do leave it, it's like when people retire and they end up on a golf course depressed.
Yeah.
Because they actually didn't move towards something. They just moved away from something, and they just are sort of like almost, just wasting their time.
They're just in a void. They stepped into a void.
They stepped into a void. And so the fact that I got to a place where ultimately I said, you know what, I'm fascinated with festivals. I'm on the board of Burning Man, and there's no great website for all the world's best festivals. Maybe I'll just go around and become the world's most interesting person and go around to festivals all over the world. And I did that, 36 festivals in 20 countries in 1 year. And that helped me.
You have a great blog post on tim.blog about some of your experiences at these festivals.
True. I do. That's right. Exactly. Yeah. So I loved that process, and it did help me move to what's next. Plus, I wrote another book. I wrote a book called Emotional Equations that did well. It became a New York Times bestseller, and it was another thing that just said, listen, like, this is my new identity. At that point, that was my fourth book, and I was like, okay, yeah, I write, I speak, I go to festivals, I live a good life. Stop, giving me shit for the fact that I'm no longer a boutique hotelier.
So you mentioned the emotional equation. So I remember this. And could you explain despair equals suffering minus meaning?
Yeah. When I had that flatline experience, and to just I was in St. Louis giving a talk. I basically probably had an allergic reaction to an antibiotic for my septic leg and my broken ankle. And I went to the other side 9 times over the course of 90 minutes.
Where were you when this happened? Did you make it to the hospital before you flatlined?
No. So I was giving a speech on crutches, which is what first sign that Chip should have been staying in bed and not been on this book tour trip. Was like, yeah, why was I on crutches on stage giving a speech? So fortunately I did not fall over at the speaker as I was standing up at the mic. But I sat down signing books, and that's when I slumped in my chair.
Ooh.
And then they put me, I probably didn't have a flatline experience there. I just went unconscious for 3 minutes. Fortunately, the paramedic showed up a couple minutes later, really quickly, and they put me on a gurney, and they had put heart monitors on me. And that's the first time of 9 times that I went flatline. And they had to get the paddles out. The first time they didn't have to use them. About 5 seconds later, my heart came again. But over the course of the next 90 minutes, in the ambulance, in the ER, etc. And I kept saying, okay, this is what I saw on the other side. And whoever was there would take a note of it. And it turns out it was the same thing over and over again. But long story short was...
Well, hold on. Let's not do long story short. You can't do long story short on near-death experiences. What did you see on the other side?
There is, by the way, a festival of a pilgrimage of the near-death experience in Spain. Spain has the weirdest festivals in the world. What I saw was this, and the fact that it happened over and over again means it's pretty remarkable and worthy to just talk about it. So I don't love the mountains. I love the beach. Mountains are okay. I do like it. I love being in nature. So it's interesting. This is a mountain setting. So it's a mountain setting, a chalet with a huge sunroof or skylight, and light is pouring in the skylight. Beautiful light. And it's pouring in such a way that there's actually this viscous oil, very heavy oil on the ground, on the most beautiful wood-grained floor you've ever seen. And it's because of the way the light's coming in and it's hitting the floor, this oil that's sort of slightly moving, or it's like going down these stairs, these beautiful wood stairs. It's casting this beautiful kaleidoscope of colors on the wall. And so what I see is light, I see colors, and I see this frangipani scented oil going down these stairs. And that's what I kept seeing. And I never saw anybody else, didn't see anybody on the other side. What I saw myself as observing, almost floating above this. I felt incredibly peaceful, and everything was moving very, very, very slow motion. So, and I kept coming back to that. And I've never actually sat down with like a dream analysis or anyone to sort of say, what does it mean? Like the fact that it's stairs going downstairs means I may be going to hell. But actually it was up in a mountain chalet way up toward heaven. I don't know. All I know is, forget about heaven and hell. What I know is in that moment, I felt beauty and calmness like I'd never felt before. So yeah, I was in the...
What did you make of that? Like, I mean, and I'm not saying it. There is no whether if you had a Freudian dream analyst here and they said, you know what that means, let me tell you. I'd be like, bullshit. Come on,
exactly.
like you can give us your opinion.
Yeah, exactly.
But
It's probably more. What
What
do I take from it?
Yeah.
What I take from it? First of all, I take from it that how I want to honor and experience beauty in my whole life. You know, the gods of efficiency, which it tends to be my religion. These gods of efficiency have a tendency to force me or have its way with me in terms of just getting very clipped in how I do things, because I have to like get all these things done. And, you know, being clipped and doing things doesn't allow for the time to sort of, you know, have the immediacy of seeing in that moment that beautiful thing. So I think what it's helped me to see is like, how do I create beautiful moments in my life? And how do I take time, you know, to do, you know, fasting day, 3 or 4 days fasting in a row and things like that allow me to just be in the moment. That's one thing. Number two is, the calmness I felt. So no fear of like, okay, you know, I'm dying and it's just going to be terrible. There was that. But I think the thing that was most interesting was just the fact that the oil was moving so slowly. It's like there's a ketchup commercial, Anticipation, a long time ago, maybe Heinz 57 ketchup. It was like, it took so much work to get that damn ketchup out of the bottle. That's how it felt. And so what it felt for me was like, I'm slowly moving to my death, but it's a long time from now. And so that's what I take from it, which is a positive, you know, overall perspective. That night, after having all those experiences, I'm by myself in a room at the hospital in St. Louis, and weirdly enough, in my backpack that I'd brought with me on this trip was Man's Search for Meaning, Viktor Frankl's book. And the reason it was there is because I'd gone through a few really rough months, and one of my closest friends, who was my insurance agent, whose name is Chip, had committed suicide 4 months earlier. And so I was trying to make sense of my life. And so here I had this book. And as I'm reading this book, I had a hard time sleeping that night. I'm reading this book, and I was just distilling, if I were to take the meaning of that book, Man's Search for Meaning, and turn it into an equation, it would be despair equals suffering minus meaning. And the way I thought of it is suffering is sort of a constant. If you're a Buddhist, and I sort of slightly am, if you believe that suffering is always ever present, it's the first noble truth of Buddhism. And yet meaning, or suffering and meaning, are actually they're sort of inversely proportional to each other. So if you do the math of like, okay, suffering, despair equals suffering minus meaning, 8 equals 10 minus 2. If you take 2 and turn it to 4, then 8 becomes 6. Right. And so despair goes down when meaning goes up. And this is when I realized that practice I've had since, you know, being a 23-year-old of writing what my lessons were for the week was a practice that actually was giving me meaning. And that equation, which I came up with that night, I ended up teaching it to all of our leaders in the company as we went into the Great Recession. And ultimately I said, darn, I went to Bhutan to study the Gross National Happiness Index because I wanted to see what's the happiness, you know, equation in life. And I ended up giving a TED talk about that. And then I ended up deciding to write this book, which was a series of 18 equations that sort of help you make sense of your emotions, whether it's happiness or disappointment or wisdom.
Are there any other equations that you find yourself referring to or thinking of more often than others? I'd
say a couple. The anxiety one's very relevant in the business world, and that's anxiety equals uncertainty times powerlessness. So it's not a plus, it's a times. So the uncertainty and the powerlessness together are combustible. So what I help people to see if they're in that space is, what is it that you can try to find some certainty about? And what is it where you can, what ways can you actually create some influence and some sense of power? And by doing that, you actually help people get to a place where they have a little bit less anxiety.
Makes it very tangible, right? I mean,
it makes it tangible. Or disappointment equals expectations minus reality. That's a classic one for any business. Like, okay, what's your customer expectation? And then what is it that you're giving as reality? And if the disappointment is more predominant than the reality, then there's going to be. If the expectations are high and reality is low, disappointment is what will come from that. So. And those both are negative. The happiness one that I learned in Bhutan was happiness equals wanting what you have, divided by having what you want. Wanting what you have speaks to gratitude. Having what you want is the process of gratification. So it's not to say this is not the so it says gratitude is better than gratification. Well, that's fine if you're a Buddhist. That's fine if you don't want to go out and attain. I want to go attain and I want to go gratify. But gratification doesn't necessarily bring happiness. It may bring success. And for a lot of people who think that success will bring happiness, they go on the hedonic treadmill and end up realizing just when they get the thing that they thought they wanted, there's some new shiny object that becomes the new thing.
The rabbit leading the greyhound around the track just sped up a little bit.
We know that one. Tim, okay. Yeah, we occasionally we go there.
Well, it's you, me, Liz, and a few million people who might be listening to this. And speaking of Liz, so this ties in very, very nicely.
Yeah.
So both you and Liz are very thoughtful and make a point of trying to be aware of your own thought processes, reasons for doing things, the drivers sort of behind the superficial answers that we're all inclined to give that are fast and easy and expedient. So one of her questions was, I noticed that Chip has made a few life changes, selling Joie de Vivre, Airbnb, now doing what you're doing. For what looks from the outside like a conscious choice to simplify his life, slow down a bit. But does he always jump into something else big and sprawling? I know a lot of people, in parentheses, like me, I suspect, just can't help themselves. How do we learn to just be still? Should we? Is that the goal?
Wow.
How do you begin to think about that?
I want to wring her fucking neck. No, I'm kidding.
But this is, I think, something that a lot of people who have become good at achieving struggle with.
Oh, totally. Peter Guber, I got to interview him on stage. He's one of the actually, Peter Guber. Yeah,
he's a fascinating guy.
We actually have both been in his box at the Warriors games. I interviewed him on stage, and this guy's 20 years older than me, and he's been successful in so many different ways. And I was interviewing him on stage at the Airbnb Open, which is our big host open that I was in charge of. We had 20,000 people in LA at this one. And so I'm on stage with this guy and listening to him and thinking, oh my God, that could be me someday. And he's an amazing guy, but he's constantly so driven to succeed at the next thing. And so what I took from that and what I take from Liz's question is, I think the real question here is not whether you're going to just be still. I love being still. The fact that I'm a meditator, the fact that I have chosen to live in Baja California, an hour north of Cabo San Lucas, on the beach, learning how to surf, and having a very simple life there, it means there's been a lot of conscious choice of how I'm curating my life, not living in San Francisco anymore. And I have these ideas that I feel like I want to go out and try in the world. But the question is, how am I executing on them? And what is my intent, or what's the sort of the silent intent for why I'm doing it? And I think for so many of the things I've done in the past, certainly Joie de Vivre was at times an exercise in seeing how big Chip's ego could get. Now, I say that not to beat myself up, but I do say that from the perspective of I was this guy who was getting a lot of my sense of self-worth from the fact that this hotel company was successful. And so my ego was on display. And then I joined Airbnb because the founders asked me to, and all of a sudden, I'm not, I was the tiny version of Richard Branson in my company, but now I'm like, instead of being the sage on the stage, I'm the guide on the side. And I'm helping these three co-founders take their little tech company and turn it into a global hospitality brand. And I realized in that process that I'm still driven. I'm still totally in it, although I actually was learning how to not do the 70-hour a week kind of thing. Not 4 hours a week or whatever you've been able to perfect.
Whatever that book was.
Yeah. So what I was realizing is that actually I'm not doing this for ego purposes. I actually feel like I'm doing this more for legacy purposes. I'm doing this to actually help them, and I believe in their mission. The Airbnb mission to belong anywhere, help people belong anywhere, and turn strangers into friends. all of that was good. And now this Modern Elder Academy that I'm doing in Baja that she's reciting there, the reality is, it is me being driven again, but I've put guard posts on it. I'm doing it in Baja. I'm doing one location. I'm not doing multiple locations. And
so you feel comfortable with that commitment?
I feel I am. Actually, and frankly, the cancer, for those who didn't hear earlier on the thing, I've got cancer. The cancer sort of was another educator of saying, I think midlife wisdom schools are a thing for the future in a huge way. I think the idea of lifelong learning and how do we go to a retreat that helps us to repurpose ourselves, reframe our mindset, to have a growth mindset about, our aspirational aging ahead of us. I think all that's important. No one's done that yet. There's been all kinds of retreat centers, but not a place that has a curriculum for people in midlife.
When you say midlife, let's put an age range on that.
Well, midlife,
or it doesn't have to be age, but how does someone know if they're in midlife as
they're in crisis
as it applies?
No, midlife has historically been defined as either 40 to 60 or 45 to 65. The truth is the phrase midlife crisis was coined in 1965. And the reason it didn't exist before then was because longevity in the US was 47 years old in the year 1900, and it became 77 by the year 2000. We added 30 years of longevity in one century. So what happened is this new era of life sort of emerged.
Right. It's not yet fade to black. It's like, no, you have another half the movie to go.
Well, you do it. And the thing that happens in midlife, and how do you know you're in midlife, whatever the age is you feel the weight of the accumulation of what you have acquired in your life. And I don't mean just the physical things. I mean the friends, the responsibilities, the identities, like the sort of invisible name tags that define who you are in the world. And you actually, frankly, are sort of feeling overwhelmed by all of that accumulation. There's this reset that happens in midlife. And you could say, frankly, with the millennial generation, it might happen actually earlier in life. It might happen at 35. Frankly, in Silicon Valley, it absolutely happens in the mid-30s, when, especially if you're an engineer, where you feel like, wow, I am no longer, I'm no longer perceived as, an up-and-comer. And in an industry that, is like the entertainment industry or fashion.
Yeah, or professional sports.
Yeah, exactly. So I think personally midlife is from 35 to 75. And part of the reason I think it used to be just 45 to 65, it's happening younger because of the fact that people feel irrelevant earlier. In the digital intelligence that we desire in companies mean that there's a greater and greater desire to hire the new digital natives. And I think it's going to last longer midlife, because if we're going to live to 100, which is sort of the future, as a longevity, we're in the right around 80 right now. But by the time we get to the end of the century, I think we'll be about at 100 for longevity in the U.S. That means at age 75, you're probably still working.
Yeah.
And at least, by choice or by necessity.
You're creating, doing something.
So I think that period of time, so midlife used to be a crisis, now it's a marathon. And that's ultimately what led me to saying, you know what, we need to figure out this wisdom school. How do people go into midlife and not think of life as being just a one tank journey? Like you fuel up with all of your, education and support up to age 20 or 25, and then you drive this vehicle that we call our bodies for the rest of our life. And at midlife, you're starting to run on fumes, and you need a pit stop. And so the Modern Elder Academy is the idea of that pit stop. And I think it's going to help to create a new category of academia or even hospitality real estate, which is the Midlife Wisdom School. Just like Canyon Ranch 40 years ago, Mel Zuckerman, overweight accountant from LA, wanted to go to a place to get healthy. And all the places that he saw 40 years ago were mostly like fat farms and mostly for women. And he ended up creating Canyon Ranch in Tucson. And it really it basically created a new hospitality real estate category called the Destination Spa Resort. Spas had existed for thousands of years, but not a category of real estate called Destination Spa Resort. So I think that's what I'm trying to do. So to answer in the long-winded way Liz's question, when I see something like that, and I can see that I can be a social entrepreneur that's actually trying to fix a societal ill, which is ageism and people getting stuck in midlife, I'm going to do that. And in this case, I'm doing it, as a social entrepreneur with a social enterprise where 60% of the people are on scholarship. So I'm funding $1 million a year in scholarships. That is something I want to bet on, but I want to bet on it as a catalyst for others to do their thing.
That's what I was going to ask.
Yeah. So like Burning Man created a great idea. And so there's a bunch of 10 Principles festivals around the world. Esalen, great idea, 1962, led to 100 personal growth retreat centers.
Got it. So the Academy is a proof of concept.
It's proof of concept and a catalyst for other social entrepreneurs around the world to say, let's create one in the Sacred Valley of Peru, or in Kyoto, Japan, or in the Catskills of New York.
Or do you think when you say, because I could see a bunch of workarounds to the one location limitation. So when you say one location, does that mean that you will be only hands-on in one location? Or do you envision some type of, for lack of a better descriptor, like a franchise model or an association or a loosely organized affiliate collection of dozens or hundreds of properties that Chip is somehow involved with?
I love your enterprising mind, and I have thought of all of those.
Yeah. Well, I just want to know, when you say I'm limiting it to one location, is there a footnote to that?
Thank God for cancer.
Yeah.
Honestly, the path that you're talking about, I was in contract negotiations on a second location and in discussions on a third location when I found out about my cancer on the second day of the book tour, right before the TED Talk, and 6 weeks before the Modern Elder Academy was opening to the public after a 6-month beta period. So at that moment, I said no. I said, and I keep saying no. The thing I will do is create sort of like the startup kit. Here's how you can create one. Not a Modern Elder Academy. We may only have one location in the world, but a midlife wisdom school. You call it what you want it to be. Here's how we can do it. I don't want to make, it could be a consulting opportunity, but I don't really care about the money on it. I'm lucky enough, thank God for the Airbnb last 6 years of being there, because I don't have to worry about money. That's for sure. I just like the idea that a legacy I can look to in my life is to create a way for people to aspire to aging. Aging is not something that we aspire to. And yet there are a lot of real unexpected pleasures of aging. The U-curve of happiness is, do you know that? Do you know?
No.
Oh God, let's talk about this. So the U-curve of happiness is so fascinating. It's so at odds with the societal narrative.
I think I can see where this is going.
So the U-curve of happiness has been proven in every country but Russia. Russia, people get happiest after they die. It's a statistical error, clearly, but there's something to that. Every other country in the world that has been studied, what they show is the following: from about age 25 to about age 45, between 45 and 50, depending on the country, is a slow decline in happiness because of that accumulation, because of that collection of things that we start to do that prepare us for midlife. And then between 45 and 50, there's this, what Brené Brown would call the unraveling. Another Texan. She's in Houston.
Oh, yeah. She might even be here in Austin now because her daughter's here.
Yeah, exactly. So the great unraveling that happens in midlife, where people actually start to discard things and they move from the accumulating mode to the editing mode. So that editing mode, the idea that people are moving into that mode leads people to get to a place where they get happier with each successive decade. So people are happier in their 50s than their 40s. They're actually happier in their 60s than their 50s. And they're happier in their 70s than their 60s. Men start to flatten out in their happiness in the second half of their 70s. Women, it starts happening in their early 80s. So in essence, what it's saying, because women live longer than men, is there's a point at which 5 to 10 years before you die, you actually start to maybe get a little bit less happy, because there can be acute health issues going on. But that's fascinating. The fact that we actually get happier as we get older, that is not what you see on the TV.
Yeah, no.
And so I think the idea that, or the aging brain, we know the aging brain, we have less recall. What's your name again? Oh, that's right, Tim. The aging brain doesn't have recall or is not as quick as it used to be. But a lot of people don't know about the aging brain is it gets more adept at doing left brain, right brain tango, which means basically the brain shrinks a little bit as it ages. It actually gets You're able to, as you get older, move from the linear left brain to the creative right brain much more easily, more adeptly. And what does that lead to in terms of a positive? It leads to being able to think more synthetically, holistically, get the gist of something. So if you want somebody on your team to actually sort of like hear it all and then distill it down to the wisdom of like what they just heard, an older person can do that better than a younger person. Younger person's much better at doing focused. So why is that relevant? Well, let's talk about Airbnb for a moment. At Airbnb, when I joined 6 years ago, we had I love the founders and they were doing an amazing job and the company would have been successful without me. But when I joined 6 years ago and it was, maybe 1/20th of the company size today, we had 30 initiatives, strategic initiatives in the year 2013 when I started. And nobody in the company, including the founders, could actually recite all of them. So later that year, we did an offsite retreat in New York, and I said to the leadership team, of which I was now a part, I was Brian's mentor, but I was also reporting to him as the head of global hospitality and strategy. I said, we got to get down to 4. So for 2014, we were only going to have 4 strategic initiatives. And so we spent 3 days arm wrestling over that one, 23 different potential initiatives that we were going to do. And it was that kind of distilling down. I think
How did you do that? Because I think a lot of people listening, maybe even one person sitting here talking, i.e. myself, struggle with long lists of prospective or current projects.
Yeah, for sure.
Right? So here you have a fast growing, very, very fast, understatement, growing startup.
Yeah.
And they have a list of how many? 20 something? Who knows?
Yeah, 23 initiatives that the 12 members of the strategic of the leadership team thought should be our potential for next year.
So how do you facilitate a process by which you get that down to 4?
Well, it's the intellectual joust.
Because you're also kind of the new guy on the job,
I was
right?
the new guy on the job, and I was the old guy on the job. I was twice the age of the average person in the company. 20 years older than, I was 21 to 23 years older than all 3 founders. But I think what they appreciated was there was an element of, I think a modern elder versus a traditional elder is the difference is the modern elder is as curious as they are wise. And it's that curiosity that opens up possibility, and the wisdom is what distills down the essence of what's important. And it's that essence of what's important that I think we got to in those 3 days in New York, where we sort of said, okay, so what is it that we want to be when we grow up? We want to be a place where people can belong anywhere. We had not said that out to the public yet, but that was the direction we were going in terms of our internal mantra of the 2 words that defined us. We also looked at, could we take the idea of the Airbnb sharing economy to office space or conference facilities or anything that had excess supply? There are a lot of natural sharing economy businesses that could be created. But we also had to ask ourselves, what's the dream of what we want this to look like 5 years from now, or maybe even 10 years from now, because Brian really wanted us to look very far into the future. And maybe that dream could help become an editing function. So for me, that reminded me of something I did back in the Joie de Vivre era when I was running my boutique hotel company. When we were trying to figure out what's our differentiator versus Marriott or even Kimpton, another boutique hotel company, we actually imagined the idea that we could ask the question, what business are we in? Because the number one Harvard Business Review reprint of all time came from an article from 1960 called Marketing Myopia by Theodore Levitt. And then management theorist and author Peter Drucker took that idea one step further. He said the most important question any business leader could ever ask themselves is, what business are we in? Well, back in my Joie de Vivre era, we took that idea of what business are we in and we turned it into a little bit of a game. The idea was we would be asking executives or senior leaders to ask themselves that question in the following manner. So one person would sit facing the other. The person asking the question would say, what business are we in? And the second person, the person answering, would say, okay, we're in the boutique hotel business. The first person would say, thank you. What business are we in? And this time, the second person, the person answering, could not answer the same way twice. And if you do that 5 times, it really almost is like an archaeological dig to figure out the essence of your company. What's your soulful differentiator as an organization? This is how we found out that we were in the identity refreshment business at Joie de Vivre. And it was this same idea that we applied to Airbnb. When it came to an offsite retreat, we did relatively soon after I joined the company. We sat our executives in pods of 2, so they couldn't hear each other. Any company could do this. And we had them go through this exercise of asking the question 5 times, what business are you in? You can't answer the same way twice. And the beauty of this is we ultimately got us to a place over the course of that day where we came to the conclusion that belonging anywhere was really the mantra, the definition of what differentiated us versus the Marriotts of the world. And it was that idea of belonging anywhere that helped us to then imagine how could we edit all of the possibilities of the things we could go into. Similarly, any executive or frankly, any person could actually ask this question in a slightly different way for themselves. The question would be, what mastery do you offer, or what mastery can you offer? So have a friend of yours ask that question of you 5 times, and you'll be sort of surprised by the 5th time you get to ask that question and you've had to come up with 4 other answers before that, what kind of revelation you may have in this archaeological dig that helps you to mine your own personal mastery.
And to go back to the Academy, whether that's a book on the reading list or an exercise or a practice that attendees have found particularly valuable, is there anything that comes to mind that people at home might try or think on?
Well, I think, the basic premise of the Academy is that in midlife, you need to sort of reframe your mindset for what's moving forward. There's a famous Carl Jung quote about you can't live the afternoon of your life the same way you did the morning. And so speaking to that, we have an exercise around evolution, evolving, because the first lesson in my book, Wisdom at Work, The Making of a Modern Elder, is to evolve. And it's the hardest one.
So evolve is the first step.
Evolve is the first step. The second step is to learn. The third is to collaborate. And the fourth is to counsel. Mm-hmm. And we can come back to that if we want in a moment. But evolve, wow, what does that mean? It really means learning to edit what is no longer serving you. So we do a lot of different exercises around the idea of liminality, which is being in between 2 things.
Right. So for people who might recognize liminal, subliminal.
Yes,
right? So
exactly.
Subliminal messages.
So a liminal is sort of right there, and it's sort of in between 2 things. It's the transition that, frankly, a caterpillar to a butterfly, the cocoon, is the liminal state. People don't like to be in a liminal state. When you're a kid, you're used to it, because everything's in between.
Everything's,
going from crawling to walking, going from pre-puberty to an adolescent and teenager. But when you're an adult, you don't like to be liminal. And yet we have all these transitions in midlife that actually make us feel liminal. So we do this exercise where there's a whole counter full of name tags, empty name tags. 40 of them are empty, 120 we've written different kinds of mindsets, ways of perspective, or ways of identifying yourself that aren't serving you anymore. Now, if you were to do this on your own, no one's going to write those for you. You'll have to write these yourself. But the process of this the process of what you can do is you actually write down anything from, my body is falling apart, or I'm never going to meet the love of my life.
So they're in part beliefs that are no longer serving you.
That's right. Millennials rule the world. There's a variety of different things we have there. And then people a lot of times use their own name tags. And what we do is the crescendo of this experience that afternoon is people slap like up to 6 different name tags on their chest. We go around a room.
The name tags that are already filled out.
As well as the ones they filled out themselves.
I see. And if they have one that they can't find, then they fill out the empty
That's right.
tag.
Exactly. And so then you go around a room, and you could do this with like 4 friends, and you go around the room silently and look at each other's name tags, and then you ultimately have a conversation one-on-one or in a small group about why these aren't serving you anymore and how you're going to be willing to get liminal and try transitioning into something new. And so as a result of that, we end the afternoon with a little fire pit. We don't walk on, any coals or anything like that. We just have people write down what's the thing that they're ready to evolve out of that's no longer serving them. And it could be some of the examples of things are like, my sense of my success in my career will no longer be my sense of success in life. That's an example of something saying, okay, I'm going to put that in the fire and then let it burn. So that's an example of a specific kind of exercise we do. We do a lot of mindfulness exercises as well in terms of helping people to calm their nervous system.
Can I pause for 1 second?
Yeah.
So the up to 6 tags on the chest, do you participate in this exercise?
I do.
Would you be willing to share some that you've burned?
Well, one of the ones since you've heard my health diagnosis, I said, like, I've recently been given a scary health diagnosis and I feel a little lost. So that would be an example of a name tag. Another name tag would be, I think I might never meet the soulmate that I met 6 years ago and no longer in that relationship. I am in the relationship, but it's turned into a different kind of relationship. Another one could be, another one that I've written and then ultimately burned is, it's time to take down the scaffolding of my ego. So what does that mean? It means, like, over the course of my teen years and growing up, you build an ego. We sort of create this container. And our ego can be a very healthy thing. It can actually create the separation. It's the thing that actually helps us to know who we are. But it is a bit of a scaffolding. And like what I mean by taking down the scaffolding of the ego is really sort of saying behind that is something that's really amazing. It's a soul, it's a heart, and I'm no longer going to let my ego sort of be the thing that I lead with. And then I, come up with a list of things, how that shows, what are the practices or ways of being that actually have to change in order for that to be the case. So those are some examples just off the cuff. I wish I had a list right here.
Do you have people prepare for the time at Modern Elder Academy in any way, or do they show up and that's sort of time zero when things begin?
They've got to read the book, Wisdom at Work, the Making of Modern Elder, and they do 2 exercises. One, which is an identity cleanse, where they actually talk to their friends about what parts of their identity work and what parts of their identity don't work so well. So they actually get some feedback. And this is before they arrive. And then they do a values inventory of, like, what are the values that are most important, and stack ranking them. So they try to get clear going into it. What are the values? Now, later in the week, they often go back to that list and say, oh my God, now that I've had some time to think about this, my values list is a little different. And so they ask themselves then, we ask them and we work with them because after people leave, that group of 12 to 18 people in the cohort, they literally, for some of the groups, have a weekly Zoom call every single week. So they're sort of accountability partners and people who can sort of help them say, okay, yeah, you said your values, number one value was this, and now it looks like it's not there anymore. What's going on? So that's part of what happens too.
Mm-hmm. What would be example values that people might then put in order?
An example some of the most obvious ones are family, religious beliefs, making a difference in the local community, or trying to change the perspective on climate change. So those are some of them. There's other ones which are sort of like ways of being, which are feeling free. So that's not some people would say that's not a value, but that's sort of a way of being.
Yeah, it could be a way of being, priority.
Yeah. So that's what they are. So it's a mixture of, I would say, values and ways of being. And we have like a list of 60 of them, and then they come up with their top 5 and then stack rank those top 5. And then over the course of the week, we don't force them to go back to it, but there's some exercises we do that allow them to, on their own, sort of look at see how those have changed.
Would you be open to talking about family for a few minutes?
Yeah.
Okay, so I would love to hear your some backstory that I don't know, and then have some questions about current day.
Yes.
So you are openly gay.
Yes.
When have you been openly gay, kind of from the get-go, or when did that?
So I was
become something that was sort of publicly, that you felt comfortable publicly
disclosing?
I was
22 when I came out. So I was and dated women, girls. I was very actively sexually in my high school. And so, but I knew behind the scenes, like there was something there. I grew up with a father who I love. Both my parents are still living. They're 81. But my dad was Stephen Sr., I was Stephen Jr., the chip off the old block. and my dad was a captain in the Marine Reserve, hardcore, dude. And I was the oldest and the only boy. And so I was meant to be like the mini version of dad. So my process of being Eagle Scout like my dad, All-American water polo player in high school, and then playing water polo at Stanford, student body president, all this stuff was like, I was on the path to be actually, my dad and I talked about this recently. He said, Chip, all I wanted you to do is be a better version of me. Huh. And that was so interesting to hear that. I always knew that was the case, but I never heard him until he's 81 years saying, it's like, Dad, I know. And that like fucked with my mind. So I did everything I could to sort of just be this better version of dad. And then I was in a fraternity at Stanford, and that's where it started like messing with my mind, being in a fraternity with a bunch of guys who I had some attraction to, but I wasn't doing anything about it. And I was dating a couple different women. And it was in between my first and second year of business school. I was 22 years old, living in New York, working for Morgan Stanley, investment banker by day, and at night walking into my first gay bar. And that's when it was like, like Wizard of Oz, Munchkinland, it went from black and white to Technicolor. I was like, oh, wow. Well, this feels a little more...
This may be a thing.
Yeah, this may be a thing. And so... But, back then, wow. I mean, I came out the summer that Newsweek had, the cover story about, the gay cancer they called AIDS. And so it was a really, really not an easy time to come out. Certainly not an easy time to come out in terms of the world that we live in today compared to then, in terms of, especially someone who's like, hardcore business guy. So when I started my company at 26, people knew I was gay, and it was sort of an unusual thing to have sort of a founder CEO of gay. I was living in San Francisco, and it was a boutique hotel company, so that made it a little easier. So I've ever since age 22, pretty much just been an outwardly gay man, and have had two long relationships, and now have a couple of sons with a lesbian couple.
So I wanted to ask you about that next. Yeah. So how did that come about?
So the women live in Houston. Laura's been a longtime friend of mine, and she asked me. Her timing was perfect. She asked me 3 weeks before I was selling my company, Joie de Vivre. And I was like the mama and the papa of Joie de Vivre. So I didn't have a co-founder, ran it for 24 years, knew almost everybody in the company, 3,500 employees. I had a lot of parent energy that had gone into my company. And I was wondering, like, wow, what's going to happen when I like step away from that? And 3 weeks before we made it public that I was actually selling, she approached me, and I'd been approached before by lesbians who wanted my sperm, but I'd always said no. And so this time I said yes. So the idea was, frankly, they're going to be in Houston. I'll be the sperm donor. I don't have any legal rights, financial obligations. And we'll see how it goes in terms of whether the boys or the kids, boys or girls, will know who their dad is. So it was that sort of like, okay, I mean, pretty transactional, although, probably a little bit more like, okay, maybe it'll be more than that, but let's see it as we go. Well, the two women ended up having two boys. And more than anything, I think the women who, they live in the state of Texas, and so the rules around this were tough. Texas is a little bit more of a conservative state, and so there was some worry that, okay, well, I'm the real biological dad, and so can the non-biological mom be a mom? And long story short is we got to a place where it was beautiful. They knew that my intentions were not to like be the full-time dad or to even be in a co-parenting role. I was there to be the boy's dad when I'm there. And I'm there, a moderate amount, and they come down to Baja a lot. And it's been beautiful. It's been a great way to give these boys a lot of love, and in essence, 3 parents instead of 2.
Number of different follow-up questions. So the first is reflecting on something you said, which is I'd been asked before and I'd said no. So I had been asked a few years ago by a very close friend of mine if I would be a sperm donor for his sister, who had just gotten out of a very long relationship, who had been kind of strung along by a guy until she was in her late 30s. And I thought very, very seriously about it. and I'd never considered it before, thought very seriously, was going to do it, and then had a friend of mine who has had at that time one young child, now has two, and he said, Tim, if you do that, you are going to need and want to be involved in some fashion. Like, it's not, I know you well enough, it's not going to sit well with you. Like, you're not going to be able to go hands-free. And so I decided not to do it. Why did you change your mind? Like, why did you say yes in this case and no in previous cases?
Well, I think this idea that literally I psychologically analyzed myself, and I thought, I really have had a lot of parent energy, being the mentor and, almost father figure for so many people in the company. And that was going to change. And I didn't necessarily understand what kind of gap that would create in my life. So the timing was perfect. So I understand what your point of view. And yet I was in a place where there was a part of me that was thirsty for it.
Yeah.
And because the women were so self-sufficient about how they wanted to do this, I figured, okay, let's see it. And I didn't know whether it was going to turn out as it's turned out, which is I'm much more integrated in the boy's life.
How did that come to be?
I think it was partly because they ended up having two boys, and I think and if they'd had the two girls, let's say, I'm not sure if it would have been different. My thinking is it might have been different. I think the fact that they're boys, like, they want their dad and they want to go pal around with dad on the beach and things like that. I think that had some influence maybe, although we've never talked about that. But more than anything, I just, you just start loving, these kids. I had a foster son. When I was 28, I became a foster parent to a 13-year-old from the Tenderloin, that district where my first hotel is, whose father's black, mom's white. And, basically, and he ended up homeless because his parents were, just not very responsible. And so I had an experience of being a parent, but it was a really unusual experience. It was me and my partner, my Israeli partner, who I was with at that time and is one of my best friends now. And here's this kid who's darker skinned, who's straight at age 13, moving in with two white gay men. And it was perfect for a sitcom. It taught me a little bit about parenting in the early days. Very different experience though. But I do think that this idea of having younger people who need your tutelage and love helps us get out of our ego. It is absolutely, there's no doubt that, it's a Zen practice to actually be with a little child, and they take all of your attention. So, but I think it's been certainly the process of how we define and create family has certainly evolved a lot in the last 3 or 4 decades.
How are you thinking about parenting, in the sense that are you going instinctive? Have you read books on the subject? There's some blogs that I've seen in the past, and I at the end of the day, the instinctive to me is best. But that between stimulus and response, I think is important, because it's really easy to be reactive with a kid who's just acting out. And sure,
it's a little more complicated in my case because I'm not with the boys every day. Whereas the moms are. And so I also don't want to pull rank and sort of do anything that suggests their approach to parenting is not my approach. So I'm pretty much instinctively trying to work with their approach as well. There's a beautiful Dan Gilbert TED talk about the fact that we all underestimate how much change is ahead of us at every different era of our life. So I think the idea of embracing liminality and sort of saying, yes, I'm moving to Austin.
Yeah.
Yes, a couple of years ago, I'm moving to Baja. And so when you embrace it and you sort of see it as just the nature of life, it allows for you to see some of the secret beauty in some of the things you might be resisting. So I would say I'm still liminal. I would say the chapter-wise, I do think my process of moving from being in the trenches, helping to run Airbnb for 4 years, and then 2 years now as a strategic advisor, a huge change in terms of my day-to-day living when I was day-to-day there versus just sort of advising Brian and the founders on things now. So I'd say that was a healthy change. But I don't know. More than anything, I'm just curious. Peter Drucker taught me that curiosity is the elixir of life. And I really believe that. And I think that the thing that makes a modern elder different than a traditional elder is a traditional elder was about being revered. It was about reverence. You revered your elder. You respected your elder. It's not about reverence anymore. It's about relevance. And relevance requires understanding the modern day world, not just spouting wisdom that sometimes is timeless and age old, but it's actually knowing how to fit that age-old wisdom into the context of modern-day problems. And so I think if I can spend the rest of my life being both curious and wise almost simultaneously, that is the potent alchemy that will make me hopefully a very happy person, but also someone who can actually influence other people in positive ways as well.
Curious and wise, and maybe also unrushed, so you can watch that oil in slow motion.
Watch that oil
going down the stairs.
Yeah. Or watch the whales. Nature is such a teacher. I got to say, being here in Austin, there's some really beautiful natural parts of Austin, and I think anybody who doesn't get romanced by nature on a regular basis is missing that lyrical sense of what life is meant to be.
Yeah, definitely. So I have just a few rapid fire questions. They don't require rapid fire answers, but I always like to ask at least a handful of these. So the first one, outside of your own books, what book or books have you gifted the most to other people, and why?
Well, other than Man's Search for Meaning, which is probably my number one gift, recently, the last couple of years, there's a book called The 100-Year Life. The 100-Year Life, written by a couple Brits, and it sort of says, imagine the future where the average person lives to 100. How is that going to change on a personal and societal basis? It's a really interesting observational book. The Happiness Curve, which we talked about earlier, it's the U curve of happiness is what we call it, but the name of the book is by Jonathan Rauch, is called The Happiness Curve. That's become a favorite to gift. I also love Danny Meyer, the restaurateur.
Yeah.
And he's got one of the best books on hospitality ever written, which is called Setting the Table. So Danny Meyer. What's the list? I might be getting. I guess we will certainly have Shake Shack. Before that, Union Square Hospitality Company.
Union
so
Square
he's got everything from Gramercy.
Gramercy,
Park.
that's what I was looking for. Because a friend of mine used to work on the line there. Actually, Gramercy Park. Fascinating guy.
Yeah.
Also, some good sort of philosophical food to chew on, right?
In terms of his
practical and philosophical, in terms of, let's say, eliminating.
Well, speaking of philosophical, thank you, Marcus Aurelius Meditations. I have given that away to a number of people. There we go.
Yeah.
And maybe Seneca. There's a Seneca book about the short life.
On the shortness of life.
On the shortness of life. One of the things he says in that book is it says something about the fact that it's not so much the shortness of life, it's how we waste it.
Yeah.
And I think there's something to that in terms of like what percentage of your life is being spent wasted. Also, a longevity thing that I've been thinking about lately is like, imagine what age you're going to live to. And on the online longevity sites say I'm going to live till I'm 98. And then ask yourself how much of your adult life, if you start counting at age 18, is still ahead of you. In fact, for me, at age 58, I'm at halftime if I live to 98. And when you start realizing you're only 50% of your way through your adult life, you take up surfing at 56 or 57.
Yeah.
You take up Spanish, which I'm doing now because I live in Mexico part of the time. Better learn Spanish. Mi español es muy malo. Yeah.
Or you write 2/3 of the books that you are going to write in your life as Peter Drucker after 65.
Yeah.
If you could put a word, a message, a quote, a question, anything non-commercial on a billboard, metaphorically speaking, to get it in front of billions of people, is there anything that comes to mind that you might put on that billboard?
Well, you mentioned Oscar Wilde earlier. I think one of my favorite quotes of all time is "Be yourself, everyone else is taken."
Yeah, that's a great
So
one.
that would be my Oscar Wilde quote. I would probably slap up there. I don't know. I think the thing I probably would, I'd probably stick with that.
Be yourself. Everyone else is taken.
Yeah.
Chip, this is so much fun.
Yeah.
It's really nice to see you again.
Yeah, it's great to be here.
And
it's going to be the first of many times, not necessarily on the show, but just hanging out.
Oh yeah. We're neighbors.
Yeah.
At this point, and people can say hello on Twitter at Chip Conley, Facebook Chip Conley author, LinkedIn Chip Conley SF, and we'll link to all this in the show notes.
Yep.
So for people who are watching or listening to this at tim.blog/podcast, you can find links to all of this if you just search for Chip. Also, you have modernelderacademy.org that people can check out. Anything else, parting comments, thoughts, suggestions, anything you'd like to mention before we wrap up?
I think I would just finish by just saying that the more we fear aging, the more we're playing on the playing field of the youth, and there's nothing wrong with that. But if you, if your intent is to just stay looking young the rest of your life, you're playing on the wrong playing field. It's a losing battle at some point. And some of us are embarrassed to see people who are continue to play on that playing field. What I think people need to recognize is whether it's the depth of our emotions, the depth of our spiritual connection with ourselves and something bigger than ourselves. These are the things that actually start to grow as we age. And it's part of the reason why we get happier as we get older.
Yeah. And you mentioned the anxiety equals, let me get this right. Don't stop. Don't tell me. It's anxiety equals uncertainty times hopelessness. Powerlessness.
Yes.
And that ties into Marcus Aurelius really nicely as well, because it's in a sense, this Stoic philosophical system, certainly as practiced by Marcus Aurelius, entailed a lot of separating what you can control from what you can't, and the possible from the inevitable. And certainly, it's hard to think of someone offhand who thought of death and mortality more than Marcus Aurelius, but learn to befriend it in a way, and not to fight something that sort of left to become this amorphous source of anxiety can really be paralyzing when, as you're doing right now, learning to embrace it and live in the liminal.
Embrace the elder. There you go. Own the word. I'm trying to bring back the word
Elder.
and separate from elderly, which is, to me, that's the last 10 years of your life.
Well, for now, modern elder. Chip, thank you so much for the time.
Thank you, Tim. It's great to be here.
Really fun. And to everyone listening and anybody watching, thank you for joining us. And until next time, be well, be safe, experiment often, and learn to live in the liminal. Pick up surfing or Spanish or something else that you've been putting off because it's not too late. Thanks, everybody.